Hello everyone, I'm James Prestwich and welcome to CIH's brand new podcast. Yes, that's right, it's 2022 and as always CIH are at the forefront of embracing new forms of media. I'm not totally convinced that podcasts are going to catch on, to be honest, but you never know. It's fair to say we might be a little bit late to the podcast party, but having not listened to any other housing related ones, I'm certain that we can find a point of difference and hopefully inform and entertain you over the coming months, years, and maybe even decades. And in years to come, you can tell your grandchildren you downloaded and maybe even listen to the very first CIH podcast. And we do have a name, which is the CIH podcast. Unfortunately, we haven't got any listeners yet. And that does raise whole philosophical question marks about trees falling in empty forests. But if I can labour that dendrology analogy just a little bit more, from tiny acorns, enormous hulking oak trees grow. We've got loads of ideas for what we can focus on over the next few months on this pod. They might be terrible, but we would really love to hear from you and not yet listening listeners with your ideas on topics that we can discuss and particularly people that you'd like to hear from. And be really ambitious. So if there's someone you really, really want to hear from about anything related to housing, let us know and we'll see what we can do. I imagine the first thing they'll ask us is how many downloads we have. I'll probably just say 3.6 million and I think we'll be all right. Because we haven't got any actual listeners yet, this whole endeavour could also be an unmitigated disaster. So we're going to keep things very simple today, but all the more brilliant for that simplicity. I'm joined by four amazing CIH colleagues from across the four nations of the United Kingdom to have what's going to be a wide-ranging, fascinating policy discussion. We've got two big caveats, though. I could be a terrible host, like Harold Wilson with his chat show, or my guests could all be terrible interviewees, like Anne Bancroft or Wogan. So two really contemporary cultural references that's going to draw in our younger listeners to this. So without any further ado, let's meet our guests. I'm joined by our Head of Policy and External Affairs, Rachael Williamson, and our National Directors for Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, Matt Dix, Callum Chomczuk and Justin Cartwright. So welcome all. And to kick off, I'm going to come to each of you in turn to just ask what's at the top of your in tray. What is focusing the minds of you and your members in your specific nation of the UK? And Matt, by virtue of where you are on my screen, I'm going to come to you first.
Well, thanks, Terry, if that's the correct one. And I'm sure we'll be trending or going viral or whatever the correct term is by the end of this half-hour period. So welcome to everyone. And what's top of the in tray? Well, I think probably like the rest of everyone around this digital table, it's probably decarb, net zero, and how we're going to do all that around supply of new housing. Building, to the EPCA rating, how we're going to retrofit our existing stock, our existing homes. The Welsh Government has very ambitious targets to be reached by 2030. So we had a big load of money announced in the Welsh Government draft budget just before Christmas, just under £1 billion for social housing grant up until 24-25, so around 300 million each year. So that's a substantial amount. We also had a substantial amount announced for retrofitting as well. But actually, when you drill down into those figures, you start looking at the detail and you think, well, is it there or thereabouts to meet the ambition that the Welsh Government has? Also building safety, also announced a big sum of money for building safety. Equalities is also another big issue. We've just been working with Welsh Government on the Race Equality Action Plan, on which there's going to be a housing chapter. And from our perspective, there was a cooperation agreement between Plaid Cymru and the Labour government just before Christmas, which included a commitment to a white paper on the right to adequate housing, which we've been campaigning with partners in the sector for a number of years now, and they're going to bring a white paper forward on it. So that's good bit of movement for us on bringing forward a legislated for right to adequate housing in Wales. So those are top of the agenda. And Christmas parties and whether we had one or not, I suppose, is the other one.
Matt, thank you very much. To paraphrase Sheriff Brodie, you're going to need a bigger in tray, I think. Rachael, if I can come to you next, please.
Thanks, James. Well, we're too busy working to have parties, aren't we, at the moment? There's a lot going on in housing and much of the same issues as Matt's referred to, but we've got some really specific opportunities as we enter 2022 to really be working as a sector to think about the shape of some of these things going forward. So there's some committee inquiries at the moment that Levelling Up Housing Communities Committee are running. So we've got social housing regulation, which we submitted a response to, and we've just been invited to give evidence to in person next month, which is a really good opportunity just to step back and think about some of the challenges and the opportunities in delivering on the social housing white paper commitments. And of course, we're all hoping that will follow through into a bill at some point. We've got exempt accommodation, which we're working on a submission to this week, which very much cuts across social housing and private rented, thinking about the regulatory gaps in there and quality of housing and what we should be doing to make sure we're supporting some of the most vulnerable. And building safety, the Levelling Up Housing Communities Committee has also opened an inquiry on that, looking at the funding of building safety remediation, which of course is kind of very much at the forefront of people's minds and thinking around how do we prepare for future net zero build, as well as going back and sorting out problems in the past, making sure that it's fair and thinking about who picks up the bill on all of those things, and hopefully not at the expense of new build coming through. So some really big issues, some of which rather contradict each other. Alongside that, we're also looking at professionalisation and thinking about some of the cultural shift that needs to happen around housing. So it's the how as well as the what. So some really good opportunities for us to feed into that, because we've got Gavin, our CEO, at the as part of the working group, and lots of stuff happening as well on the private rented sector. So we've just been invited to a roundtable on that, looking at data and what might need to happen as we move forward and prepare for the renters reform bill. So lots of opportunities, and of course alongside that we're all eagerly awaiting the Levelling Up white paper to see what that might say on housing as well.
Thanks, Rachel. And I reckon levelling up will be a really good topic for a future podcast, particularly on how that's going to play out, not just in areas of England that have been viewed as being left behind by the government, but also other nations, the UK as well. So I'm sure we can have another fascinating discussion on that, and that is on my list. Callum, can you give us a little bit of an update on what's going on in Scotland?
I can indeed. So pretty similar to what Matt and Rachel were saying. So decarb is probably the biggest issue that we're dealing with. So back in autumn, we published Heat and Building Strategy. So I think a pretty massive vision for decarbonising Scotland's housing stock. But the big questions about actually how do we fund it? We're talking about moving the EPC rating of the private renting sector up to C by 2027 or 2028, which is basically tomorrow. And actually, what is the impact going to be in the private renting sector? I can't imagine we're going to have as much private rented stock in 5 years' time if they're all going to have to hit that rating. So there's big questions about actually how we deliver that. And then we've also got the government looking at the kind of renting sector, and then looking at more equalisation of standards. So not just great new standards on decarbonisation, which are great, but actually kind of whole housing standards, what the kind of quality of the building looks like, which is actually, that gets into a kind of really interesting discussion around actually should we have any differentiation even between housing standards. In Scotland we've got tolerable standards, which is kind of what homeowners have got. You've got repairing standards and the PRS, and you've got the Scottish Housing Quality Standards, which basically go incrementally improve. But why do we have different standards? Why does one type of tenant or homeowner deserve a lesser or a higher standard than somebody else? So I think there's an interesting debate about actually what is an absolute core standard that we should have, and then the tricky bit is about kind of who pays for it. And the other big thing we're probably looking at as well, and we're trying to make this case in Scotland, is just that putting kind of picks on some of what Rachel's saying about professionalism and the kind of what's in the social housing white paper in England, is that discussion on professionalism, because probably much like the rest of the UK, Scotland, we've got so many housing strategies and they're great and they're brilliant. They talk all about the buildings and the homes, but they talk nothing about the profession. But if we talk about the NHS, you never talk about the NHS. If you talk about talking about doctors and nurses, you talk about education, you always talk about teachers. So why is it time after time we talk about housing and we never talk about housing professionals? So that's the big thing right now. That's the stuff we're trying to kind of lobby on. There's loads in there, but I think for me the big thing is really, I think the debate on professionalism is starting to grow, and I think it will build over years to come. But I think right now is the interesting bits around the standards, the homes. Like what is our suitable standards for home, irrespective of tenure. And I think we're probably at different stages across the UK in that, but I imagine we're having similar conversations.
Absolutely. Thanks, Callum. I'm fascinated by the idea of a tolerable standard. I know that language is really important, and it doesn't sound like a great standard.
I mean, the thing about a tolerable standard, it is, ultimately it's kind of homeowners that have it themselves. There's an element of kind of self-responsibility. Yeah. It's the repairing standard almost in the private renting sector, but none of it sounds particularly aspirational, does it? Tolerable repairing, it sounds pretty weak. Whereas the Scottish social housing quality standard, that sounds like that's something that you'd want to have, and that ultimately I think is where we're going to have to get to. But the same issue is who pays for it, the government or tenants, because ultimately that's the only choices we've got.
Yeah, Justin, over to you then with the Northern Ireland context.
Thanks, James. I'm going to take a stab here and say that I'm the youngest on this call. I could be wrong with that. I can reassure listeners that my CIH colleagues are a fresh-faced bunch indeed. But what it does mean in practice is that a lot of James's pop culture references go over my head, which does make me sad. I'd love to be Generation X, but the internet says I'm a millennial, and that's just something I have to live with. But in terms of the big housing issues in Northern Ireland, I think the biggest thing is the recent announcement of a new draft housing supply strategy from our minister that's causing something of a debate in whether it's ambitious or not ambitious. But the headline is that she has an ambition to deliver 100,000 homes over the 15-year lifetime of the strategy. So to put that in context, so that's probably, just over 6,600 per year total. So that's more than what the house growth indicators say that we need, but it's less than what we were building prior to the pandemic. So naturally that started a debate around its ambition, but I do think where it is particularly ambitious is that the minister says that she wants a third of those 100,000 homes to be social homes, which is just over 2,200 social homes every year. Now, to put that in context, if we look at, say, the last 10 years, on average, we're building just under 1,500. So that's putting a whopping 50% on what we've actually been able to deliver in practice. And the finance hasn't been so much of an issue. It might be because we've just moved back to multi-year budgets for the first time in several years. And there is a funding cliff edge in the final year, so budgets might become an issue in future. But, it's issues that we're facing all across the UK. We have a unique issue around water infrastructure capacity, but beyond that, it's the skills issue, it's the cost and availability of materials. All of those things that conspire to frustrate everywhere else are just as relevant here. So there's a big question mark over what we can do to pull together to achieve those numbers. But on the face of it, I certainly think it's ambitious and it's a move in the right direction. And just finally, there is a specific objective of the strategy to tackle net zero emissions, and that's an area where Northern Ireland is quite behind. We don't have any sort of strategy or action plan around heat and buildings, so that's going to be quite important to act quickly around that. But all in all, no, I think it's an ambitious strategy and certainly a step in the right direction.
Thanks, Justin. So it seems to me like there's some common themes that we can try and pick out of that, and we've only really got about half an hour, so to try and go and cover off all of the things that we've talked about in that first 10 minutes or so would be next to impossible. So I reckon there's a couple of things we should try and pick out from there, and other topics we can say for subsequent episodes. But so I think we've all talked about the net zero challenge, and we've all talked about the challenge of supply and the way that some of those conflicting spending priorities kind of interact, and what that does in terms of putting pressure on the businesses of social housing providers and local authorities as well in particular. So what I'm not going to do is ask the $1 million question, which is, well, how are organisations going to pay for all of this? But what I am going to do is ask if there is any emerging thinking in any of the nations of the UK and how that debate's going. So, the big question is, how are we going to afford all of that? How are we going to afford to decarbonise our stock and keep building? What are some of the debates that are being had in the nations about how that's going to be manageable? Callum?
So in Scotland, we've got, much like what Justin was talking about, we've got a pretty ambitious programme for affordable house building. Got 110,000 homes over 10, 11 years, which is pretty sizable and it's come off a pretty positive programme. And I think there's that balance, isn't there? There's a bit about three parts to it, I think. How do you retrofit? How do you build new supply? And how do you keep rents affordable? And they're all in tension with each other. And I honestly just don't think we can. I just don't think we have the money. I'm not trying to be doom-laden, but I just don't think. And I think ultimately landlords' priorities are going to be about looking after existing tenants and addressing the climate emergency. And I am not confident that we will hit the targets. I want to meet the targets. I think we should meet the targets, but I just don't. I think given the slowdown in construction that there has been, even the last 6 months, 9 months or so, I think to maintain a pace of construction would require much more capital investment. And I think for landlords, you have to make business decisions. And it's just so hard to hit that incredibly aspirational target in Scotland, 110,000 affordable homes, while keeping rents low and investing in a massive retrofit. Not just decarbonisation, but accessibility and other standards as well. And I think something is going to have to give. I'd love to be told wrong. I'd love somebody can come up with kind of new ways to deliver it. I think we're going to massively look at strategic acquisition as well. I don't think we're going to build our way out of this. I think we're going to buy more from the private renting sector. I think we're going to reuse other existing buildings because we can find ways to build homes cheaper if we do that. But I don't think even that will get us to the target. So I think we probably will have to fall short, but I think we probably have to recognise that the reason we're doing that is because we're making the homes for existing tenants better and addressing the climate emergency. And I think we probably have to be reasonable as a sector about recognising if we're making progress on keeping rents low and zero carbon, then not hitting that target is probably an acceptable price. But that's where I am.
Some tough choices to be made and some tough conversations to be had with government and ministers who have aspirations around house building targets, residents as well, tenants and residents too, and that whole fundamental point about who is social housing in particular for. Is it purely for the people who are living in it at the moment, or is it for future generations or people that want to live in it and aren't currently able to? So some fascinating themes there. Justin, if I come to you next then.
Thanks, James. I think what we need in Northern Ireland is a start around this stuff. We do need. It was interesting, we had a debate at our board recently because one of our manifesto asks for the upcoming Assembly election was a heat and building strategy. And the board sort of said, well, can we ask for a heat and buildings action plan instead? There's almost this fear of strategies and everything that comes with it, particularly in the Northern Ireland context where the wheels do tend to move slowly. So we need a start around this stuff. We need a specific fund for social housing to tackle some of those older homes, homes that weren't sold under the right to buy. Of course, a lot of those are concentrated within the housing executive. So we need a specific fund for social housing. I think we need to unlock existing streams of finance as well. There tends to be a way that whenever we get Barnett consequentials, the executive has an approach of, housing already gets loads of money, and it does. There's a good financial commitment to it, but we need to ring fence some of that money that comes across that flows on from green investment in Britain. And I think we also need streams of finance and grant rates for certain private rented homes as well. So as part of the current private tenancies bill that's moving through the Assembly, we're going to set minimum EPC ratings for private rented homes, which I know already apply in England, but there's a question mark around, certain homes that are traditional build, solid brick that don't have cavity walls. So it just means that it might have a high investment requirement as a proportion of capital value. Because what you don't want to do is incentivise landlords to start selling properties and have these older homes pass from pillar to post until it falls on somebody to deal with it. We want to address it ASAP. So I think, in summary, we need a start and a fair bit of cash to get us in the right direction on that, I'd say.
Thanks, Justin. And the one thing we haven't mentioned yet is the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic. And we know from last year's UK Housing Review that certainly in England, at least, the pandemic impacted on the delivery of affordable homes quite markedly. Actually, they were down on the year before. So we've got that whole interaction with a hopefully once in a lifetime pandemic to factor into all this as well, and are almost behind the curve as far as the supply side of things is concerned before we've got started. Rachel, can I bring you in at this point?
I think just on that, James, we know the pandemic has delayed affordable housing across the piece in the UK, but played out differently. But in England, we know overall supply fell by about 12%. So as you say, we're already a bit behind the curve. it strikes me that what's really needed is to look at this in a wholesale sense, and maybe the levelling up white paper and the conversations around that might be an opportunity to try and find the positives, because from what we hear anyway, there'll be a big focus on regeneration, and if that is serious in terms of homes and wider communities, we need to look at this in that wider sense, don't we? And certainly I think at the moment we've got lots of strategies and lots of funds, but just like Justin said, it feels like what we need is an action plan. And we need to stop looking at sort of net zero retrofit separately from what needs to happen on building safety. If you're going to start going into people's homes to deal with issues, you need to be looking at that in one go rather than kind of piecemeal, which obviously just causes more disruption and costs more. So I think there's something around how you bring the tenant voice into all of that and how you do it with people so that they're bought into the process. And obviously, again, looking across tenure. So we tend to focus quite a lot on what might need to happen in the social housing sector, but we need to look at housing across the board, don't we, and find the opportunities where they're there. But I don't think we know enough yet about what's going to have the most impact. And it feels to me like we just need we need to work with government on a mapping exercise to say this needs to happen by then in order for this, working back from the targets, if that's still what we're working to, and be really honest about what's going to make the difference and what it's going to cost. And as Callum said, the money has to come from somewhere, and it can't all be transferred through to higher rents.
And this not to downplay the absolute priority of building safety as well, and I'm sure we'll have an entire podcast on building safety. And I know landlords are in different places with this, and the impact for some organisations is enormous, and for others not quite so much. But clearly that is, for whichever organisations are affected, that is spending priority number one, isn't it? Because the bare minimum is that the homes that landlords, whatever tenure they, whatever sector and part of the rented sector they are, that the homes that they're renting is safe, and that is absolutely priority number one. So you take that as your first order issue, and then all these other enormous issues, which are of themselves, in and of themselves, colossal challenges, absolutely have to come second and maybe even third on that list of priorities. Matt, can I come to you now for the Welsh input?
Well, yeah, I mean, just to quickly reiterate on that point, I mean, a lot of discussions going on here about, if you pull in all the cladding off, etc., to do the remedial work on building safety and fire safety, etc., then there's opportunity to do the retrofit work at the same time. So you're doing that work at the same time, you're reducing economies of scale, etc., and getting more bang for your buck. So that really needs to be considered. I mean, kind of the point that Callum was making. I mean, really big ambitions here. About 20,000 new social homes at low carbon social homes by the end of this Senate term, and I think the new development is probably the easy side of things. I can see us getting to that stage. It's going to have to take a bit of moving things around, moving investment around, but and there are barriers to that, inflationary pressures, supply chain pressures. So some work needs to be done on that at a macro level, from UK government in particular, but also devolved nation governments and Welsh governments about more domestic supply chains, materials, reducing costs that way, but sort of leading into more sort of wider discussion about building housing into the sort of economic development and build out better from the pandemic. In Wales, a lot of discussion about the circular foundational economy model. A lot of investment going into. This sounds very sort of sandal wearing, socks with sandals, but the Welsh government wants to build 80 million trees over the next 10 years, to underpin a timber industry, that can supply timber for the house building and wider construction industry. I mean, that's going to take a while to come online, but it's those sort of key macro strategic changes that we need to think about housing as a foundational economy anchor that we can build out better, and that takes a lot of investment, at that more macro level. And you mentioned levelling up. Maybe that's something that the levelling up agenda can sort of look at, because that's all about skills, and that's another matter that we haven't even factored in yet. Have we got enough skills, the right skills for net zero to build? We're just about to undergo a piece of work in Wales looking at that from a Wales Pacific, but I know it's an issue that's across the four nations. Thanks,
Matt, and good mention of trees as well, keeping the dendrology theme.
And sandals.
Yeah. I googled dendrology because I realised I didn't know what the study of trees was, and I'm not sure it technically fits. I think it's shrubs, but it's close enough. I wonder whether, because one of the themes that I think has come out of all of that, and I'll come to you all again in a sec, is around levelling up then, and the role that housing could, should, might play in the government's levelling up agenda. And I think you can call levelling up whatever you want to, really, and I guess as an idea or as a concept, it can be claimed by whichever government wants to claim it. But I don't think anyone, wherever anyone is on the political spectrum, can disagree with the idea behind it. A more equitable country in terms of kind of economic and social opportunity, and spreading as much as you're able to without impacting negatively on any part of the UK, spreading the wealth and the opportunity for growth. So that I think we probably take as read is a really positive thing. But maybe what's missing a little bit from all the talk about levelling up is housing and the role that housing will play in that. Callum, it looks like you want to come in on that.
Yeah, I suppose the first thing to say is the term levelling up does not exist in Scotland. I think that's right, though. I think you're right, but the concept does. And I think one of the things we probably do with every strategy or action plan is there's always really good stuff. There's always stuff we want to see, and we always work with government and other stakeholders to deliver, and that's great. And there's a wee bit of vision there, but is it detailed enough? We can argue. But I think that's what we need more of that. I think we need more of vision about the kind of what is the role of housing. What's the role of the rented sector? How is that supposed to be used to catalyse kind of a well-being economy and improve people's life chances? Because that's what I think, it's that deeper vision we need to focus on. Sometimes we understandably, because we all do it, we get focused on keeping rents low, supply, these kind of numeric, and it totally makes sense because they're easy to understand, and we all absolutely focus on it. But we do need a vision. We need a vision for the size of the rented sector. Because, actually, the points Justin's talking about we've got huge ambitions. So, actually, we need to decide how big should the rented sector be? How big should the social rented sector be and the private rented sector? And it's different in different parts of our country. And we need to be relaxed about growing it somewhere and shrinking it elsewhere. And we need to recognise a bit why we need to be positive about the private rented sector, because it can get demonised a lot. But actually, private sector is so important because it provides a flexibility and a choice that we know doesn't exist because we don't have enough social housing. So I think there's much more we need about a really clear vision about the role of the rented sector, and if we have that, and then about how that creates kind of opportunities for everybody. But it's ultimately underneath it all, we need enough rented affordable homes, absolutely. But I think there's something more there about that vision about the size, the scope, and scale of the rented sector, and being relaxed and having that discussion about how we shrink it in some areas and grow it in some others.
We've had a Labour government in power since devolution in '99, and they unashamedly refer to themselves as socialist government. So I suspect they'd argue that levelling up is in their DNA and in their ideological purpose. So I don't. Yeah, no one would disagree with the philosophy behind it. And if we haven't all got a safe, affordable, sustainable, warm place to call home and go home to of an evening, and eat and be able to afford to eat properly, etc., then we stand no chance of levelling up in any form or shape or whatever. So housing is central to that. I suppose you can level up across tenures, etc., and make that experience more equal, and that should be a goal, from a housing professional and housing policy perspective more generally. I suppose levelling up, as I understand it, is about skills and levelling up economic opportunities across the regions and nations of the UK, and in that side of things, I suppose is what I was alluding to before. It's about skills, and house building, and building all different types of housing becomes a base of our economic development, our economic growth, and that is about the skills side of things. And there's a lot of work for the housing profession to do in terms of understanding what those skills need to be, so that we can work with government to invest in the right areas. Because I don't know whether anyone around the table can give a definitive answer of have we got the right skills in the right places to do the right things in order to build enough houses and the right types of houses to meet the sort of accessibility agenda, affordability agenda, and green agenda. So I think housing has to be central to that, because it's a lot of activity in the economy.
Justin, how's that debate being framed then in Northern Ireland?
I think, James, it's probably similar to what Callum says. Certainly in the housing context, levelling up doesn't seem to be a thing. I actually had to do a bit of searching on the interwebs here to see where the levelling up money was being spent. I did find one of the council websites here saying that they successfully secured some of the cash for 2 section of greenway routes, which is very lovely. You know, Northern Ireland's very picturesque, and I live around some greenways, and they're fantastic, but, you know, very, I suppose, tangential in terms of how they relate to housing. You know, it's about connectability, and it's about place and all that kind of thing. But yeah, another potential income stream for some of the challenges in housing. So something worthwhile pursuing, I think.
Thanks. And I think what's really interesting as well, you know, as Rachel said, it looks as though regeneration is going to be a theme of the levelling up agenda in the kind of Westminster context, in the English context in particular. But, you know, of course, those of us that worked in social housing a while will remind people that this side of the border, at least, there's no grant funding for regeneration of social housing schemes, and that remains a serious barrier then to overcome if you want to try and get a scheme to stack up in areas of lower demand or lower house prices. So something that I think we would like to see reflected maybe in the debate around levelling up. Rachel.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think if you went and asked the man on the street or the woman on the street, what do you understand, you know, we mean by levelling up, you'd have very different answers, wouldn't you? And until we see the white paper, I suppose we can only give our personal take on it. I mean, to me, it's about redressing the balance and, you know, pushing for a more equitable society without wanting to sound totally utopian. And, you know, there's some great ambitions within there, but for as long as we have people unable to pay housing costs and living in fuel poverty, living in temporary accommodation or on the streets, all of it rings a bit hollow, doesn't it? And I think the reality is at the moment, there's probably more of a focus on how people feel they're being levelled down rather than levelled up with some of the decisions that are and how they're impacting when you look at infrastructure promises that are not coming through. As you say, grant funding not coming through to actually deal with some of the issues. So, you know, it's great that this is something we're talking about, but housing is so central to it. I think, you know, we need to see some serious long-term investment and commitment, and it needs to go beyond sound bites. And if it's to make any real difference, it's got to have some cross-party consensus to really see some of it through. Otherwise, it will be another short-term initiative.
Yeah, and it's actually, when you think about the levelling up debate, is generally framed as London and the South East, and then the rest of the United Kingdom. And of course, we know that the nature of the housing crisis is different in different parts of the country. And despite the relative prosperity of London and the South East, it has a horrendous housing crisis, both in terms of affordability and in terms of homelessness as well. So again, just quite an interesting counterpoint to some of the narrative around it needing to be a London versus the rest of the UK argument. Matt.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you know, obviously there's house price inflation everywhere. You know, I think Wales is amongst the highest at the moment in terms of inflationary pressures on the housing market. But, you know, what does levelling up mean? You know, some ideologies may think, well, levelling up means, you know, allowing everyone the opportunity to be a homeowner, for example, whereas other ideologies may think, well, actually, no, it's about providing the right type of housing, affordable, accessible housing in the right places at the right time. And it's not about home ownership. So you have, you know, conflicting sort of views on what levelling up would be in terms of the housing market or housing provision, which then brings forward very different policy processes and implementation in different parts of the country, and then effect on fiscal streams that those different policies have. So, you know, you might have in one part of the country a jurisdiction concentrating on the demand side, which has been the case for a long time, and others concentrating on the supply side, and how that marries itself together in the context of levelling up across the union. It's almost those contradictory pressures that may impact on certain, you know, parts of or certain jurisdictions to be able to pursue their ambition in their areas. So it's interesting to see what will be in the white paper. I mean, having conversations with people about it at the moment is a bit of a stab in the dark, as you say, Rachel, isn't it? But yeah, I can't see how housing can't be a part of it and a central part of it. So, you know, let's see what comes down.
Thanks, Matt. And good use of fiscal streams, which sounds like an American housing scheme. in like a 1980s kids film.
That's where all the trees I mentioned or planted.
Rachel, can we come to you then?
Yeah, just on Matt's point there, and I think really thinking about how you can devolve policy and decision making in a meaningful way to understand how different things will work differently in different places is hopefully the direction we're heading in some of this. But it raises some really big questions, doesn't it, on how do you actually do that? Interestingly, though, there's a bit of coverage, I think, in The Guardian this morning around the majority of people actually working on levelling up, informing this policy at the moment are based around London. And I think that's the challenge, isn't it? As for as long as you've got the slightly sort of London metropole way of thinking feeding into what might be needed for the rest of England or the UK, you have a slightly distorted view of the world. And to really meaningfully look at this, we need to understand that the world or the UK is very different to different people in different places. And as you say, Matt, there's some really big questions at the heart of it. And it'll be interesting to see how much government actually wants a debate on that versus an opportunity to just reframe their strategy post-Brexit on where they're trying to take the country and the UK.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? Callum, go on.
I think Rachel raises an interesting point there about actually the people who are developing kind of housing policy. In my experience, I've only been with CIH almost 4 years, but my experience is that the housing sector is full of really well-meaning middle-class professionals, most of whom have never lived in social housing. Not all, absolutely not all. Many have, but it's just interesting to drill on that point about actually, and it's not like lived experience is the absolute only thing that you need, but it is interesting that the people we all probably engage with mostly are probably very similar to ourselves, probably very similar background, probably went to university, probably had a nice middle class professional job. Possibly not, I am making absolute assumptions, but there is something about actually having greater diversity within the kind of housing sector to ensure we're getting the right policy, so it's not just a kind of London issue. I think it's a sectoral issue, and how do we ensure that not just CIH or other representative organisations, but actually landlords have kind of diversity in the kind of the broadest possible sense, so we're getting better and more thoughtful policies and we're understanding the kind of solutions that people need.
I think that's a great point on which to start to think about wrapping things up. And certainly one of the intentions with this podcast is, as much as possible, we're going to look to reflect a broad and diverse range of voices, and very, very keen in particular to hear from tenants of social housing, from those who have lived in social housing at periods during their life, not just from those whose interaction with social housing has been working in the sector. So I think that's a really interesting place to finish. And I get the impression we could have spoken all day about this. I really hope it's not going to be dull and boring when people listen to it back. I don't think it is. I think it's going to be quite interesting with mention of fiscal streams and building trees. I think you said, Matt, which is
you need a catchphrase, James, as the chair. You need a Terry Wogan catchphrase to sort of sign things off with.
Yeah, I mean that will need to develop. I could do a Bruce Forsyth silhouette when I walk on stage, but we'll see how things go with that. So look, thanks so much to all of you for contributing. It's been a fascinating discussion, and we'll see you all again soon.